Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm going to take today's video to talk about political philosophy in general and some of the major schools of thought that have developed in political philosophy over the past couple of hundred years now. Modern political philosophy really begins with the Enlightenment. So if you're interested in the historical context, you can go watch my video on the Enlightenment. But political philosophy, to make a couple of distinctions right off the bat. So political philosophy is closely related to political science, but they are not the same. Political philosophy deals with the sort of bigger issues and bigger discussions that are involved, where political science gets a little bit more specific. What I mean by that, and another way to phrase that, is that political philosophy deals with the theory of it all, and political science deals with some practical applications of those theories. However, there is a lot of overlap. These two areas of study aren't clearly demarcated, aren't clearly separated from each other. So you'll notice some similarities there, but when I talk about political philosophy, what I am not talking about are the current political distinctions that you'll see, for example, in the United States, the separation between Republicans and Democrats. Although we will use labels that are often tossed around in political conversations, such as liberal and conservative, within the realm of philosophy, those labels mean slightly different things. So let's jump into it. As I mentioned in my intro to philosophy video, political philosophy is a sub-branch of ethics generally construed. So ethics is the big umbrella term. And ethics, as I explained there, deals with the question of how should I live my life? What is the good life? What is the best way? What are the best rules, guidelines, dictates that I should abide by in order to live the best life that I can possibly live? As Aristotle pointed out, political philosophy is a move from asking, how should I live my life? Now, humans oftentimes do not live in isolation. We oftentimes do not live in solitude. We live with other people. Humans, according to Aristotle, are social animals, right? We construct and we thrive in society and societal structures. So in political philosophy, we move from the question of the individual, how should I live my life, to the collective, how should we as a group live our lives? What's the best way to organize ourselves, right? This is where we get into conversations about political philosophy. So political philosophy deals with there's some specific questions that it addresses, or that it seeks to address. These are classic questions. What ought to be a person's relationship to society? What are my obligations, my ethical obligations to the society in which I live? What is the best form of government? That's a big one. How should we best organize ourselves? Is there a best form of government? Why should I obey the law? Right? What is the relationship between government and individuals? All of these questions lie at the heart of political science. And as you can imagine, for each one of these questions, there's thousands of different answers. So what I want to do, I'll give you a brief introduction to the evolution of political thought over the course of human history, and then some of the big picture answers to these questions. But a little bit about history to talk about how political philosophy has developed practically over the centuries. So with the advent of the Neolithic Revolution in the 12th century BCE comes the establishment of government. The Neolithic Revolution, referring to the developments in agriculture that took place in the major river-based civilizations such as Egypt, Mesopotamia, ancient Indian culture, ancient Chinese agriculture civilization. As soon as humans start to conjugate into cities, as soon as those cities reach a certain population point, they naturally start to organize themselves. And it's at this point that we see the beginnings of governmental institutions in human history. For the most part, most ancient civilizations shared very similar structures of government, typically centered around the idea of kingship. There's very few exceptions to this rule, ancient Athens being one of those. But kingship slash monarchy was the first system of government that was established. Before the Neolithic Revolution, before 12,000 BCE, most societies, most humans lived and worked in family groups ranging anywhere from 10 to 50 people. These family groups were largely egalitarian. Now, to be clear, most of what we know about these family groups, they didn't really leave behind a lot of archaeological evidence. Most of this is based on our examination of current hunting and gathering societies. And in current hunting and gathering societies, you have specific roles that people carry out and play out within the group. So some people go and hunt, some people stay at the camp and they prepare the food slash repair the houses and do all the basic like upkeep of the day-to-day life. Some people go out and scavenge for food, collecting roots, berries, all kind of various foodstuffs. But we call these societies egalitarian because, generally speaking, there was no social hierarchy, right? Let's say that I'm a hunter. Whatever I hunt is shared with the group. Same if I'm a gatherer. Whatever I collect, whatever I gathered is shared with the group. If I'm staying back at camp and I'm responsible for, let's say, taking care of the children that are running around, I'm taking care of everybody's children, not just my children. So the workload is equally distributed, and the role that people play in those groups, no one person is seen as up on another social rung than another person. Everybody's equal. That changes with the advent of government. With the institutions of government in the Neolithic Revolution, we immediately have a class divide. We immediately have the division between the working people, the people that are running. Most of these societies are agricultural, right? It's the agricultural revolution. Most of the quote unquote wealth that's being produced is being produced in the form of agriculture. And with the advent of government comes the placing of someone over where that wealth is going slash distributed, however you want to put that. Again, this typically came in the form of a king, in the form of a strong man ruler. The first example that we have of this in history is Sargon of Akkad, and Sargon enforced his power through military might. If you were a farmer, you gave a portion of your proceeds to Sargon. Why? Because if you didn't, Sargon would hurt you, is the very simplistic breakdown of that power dynamic there. Now, we do get more complicated forms of kingship that develop in these ancient civilizations, specifically this idea of divine right. The idea of divine right is the merging of political power with religious authority. Again, this takes place across the board. Pick any ancient civilization, you're going to see a form of divine right in place, from the ancient Aztecs to the ancient Egyptians, To the ancient Chinese and ancient China, this was referred to as the mandate of heaven. It's all divine right. The idea that the person who's in political power, the king, was put there by the gods or put there by God. That God had chosen that person specifically to rule over the people. And this eventually emerges into a form of hereditary monarchy, where the king would pass down his power to his son or pass down his power to somebody who married one of his daughters. And the idea of a family, of a lineage that was chosen by the gods emerged. All of this changes with the Enlightenment and the emergence of rights-based ethical systems, which you can delve a little deeper into in the writings of Hobbes and Locke. The three big figures here, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, were some of the first political philosophers to challenge this idea that had been established in history of divine right, of monarchy. They're challenging it on the basis of this question that I asked before. Where does government derive its right to rule? What is the relationship between government and individuals? Where does governmental power come from? And you're probably, if you're hearing this should ring some bells, because the ideas that were developed by Hobbes and Locke are actually implemented in the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution is a rights-based constitution, specifically, of course, the Bill of Rights is what I'm talking about there. And you also see evidence of this in Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. But that was a huge political change that fundamentally altered how we understand the relationship between people and the governments that rule over those people. And the next huge change comes with the Industrial Revolution, which starts in Great Britain in 1750. The Industrial Revolution is important for political philosophy because the Industrial Revolution will fundamentally alter the economic makeup of society. Prior to industrialization, there was really no such thing as the middle class. You had the extraordinarily wealthy, the aristocratic people, and then you kind of had everybody else. Now, there was, of course, it's not to say that everybody was on those two ends of the spectrum. I'm talking about most people. With industrialization, that starts to change. And with industrialization, you start to get the emergence of a middle class, the emergence of more wealth that is being produced. But at the same time, industrialization produces a greater disparity between the rich and the poor. The rich will get richer, and the poor, the poorest of the poor, will get poorer. And this, of course, has a direct impact on the ideas that are being developed in political philosophy. So let's talk about some of these major ideas. Now, although I argue that political philosophy developed during the Enlightenment, some of the ideas that are adopted by political philosophy have their origins, of course, in ancient philosophy. Conservatism is one of these ideas that has never been like rigidly defined. It's kind of always been there in one form or another. A big example of this, of course, is Confucianism. Confucianism oftentimes gets charged with being a form of conservatism. If you go watch my video on Confucianism, I kind of clarify some of those points. But conservatism, very loosely speaking, we have a quote here by Thomas Sherlock. Conservatism is an attempt to maintain the established form of government, is the first and highest duty of men acting in society. So a loose definition is that conservatism is a political movement which seeks to maintain the established traditions that are in place in society. Conservatism is, in this regards, opposed to rapid change. Specifically, is generally opposed to political movements that seek to fundamentally alter our social institutions. So it's opposed to revolutionary thinkers. It's also opposed to, as we'll see later, like socialist thinkers who want to radically change our economic situation. Another quote here by Anthony O'Hare about conservatism is an approach to human affairs which mistrust both a priori reasoning and revolution, preferring to put its trust in experience and in the gradual improvement of tried and tested arrangements. So it mistrusts these calls for radical social reform, instead wanting to put our trust in these established institutions, because these established institutions have already proven themselves, they're established for a reason, is the thought process behind this, right? They become established because there's something about them that works. And instead of like tearing those down and starting from the ground up, that gradual reform of those institutions should take place. So you can kind of see this on a scale here. Conservatives, generally speaking, support gradual reform over time, as opposed to radical, full-fledged reform in the form of like a political revolution. And most of the time, but not always, conservatives usually take a pessimistic view of human nature, that humans in some way, shape, or form needs these social institutions, or else we'll just revert into violent chaos, is the thought process there. Some, not all. Now, if conservatism is on one end of the spectrum, liberalism would be on the other end of the spectrum. Liberalism, modern liberalism, well, we have a couple distinctions to make here. Liberalism emerges in the Enlightenment by people like Hobbes and Locke. Yes, it emerges with this. Liberalism kind of comes about with the development of rights-based ethics. And liberalism as a general umbrella concept is closely connected with this idea of innate natural human rights. By definition, we have another quote here. By definition, a liberal is a man who believes in liberty. Liberty meaning individual freedom, right? You see this reflected especially in the writings of John Locke, who argues that in a state of nature, people are inherently free to do whatever we want. And that it's only when we enter the social contract with society that we start to sacrifice or give up aspects of that freedom, but that the purpose of government ought to be, its primary role ought to be to maintain and protect human freedom. This is where the general idea of liberalism comes from. Now, this gets a little confusing because today there is a fundamental disagreement in liberalistic thinking. Liberalistic? I don't know if that's a word. In liberal political philosophy, a basic divide between what's called classical liberalism, sometimes pro-individualist liberalism, and modern liberalism. The split is represented. We do have some labels here that might make this a little bit more clear. So the split between classical liberals and modern liberals. So a classical liberal would be in the US more similar to what we would call a libertarian. The emphasis of libertarianism is on the individual's liberties and the protection of the individual's liberties, that I should be as free as possible to do what it is that I want to do with little or no government intervention. So this is why it's called an individualistic, the individualistic branch of liberalism, libertarianism, as opposed to the form of liberalism, which is called modern liberalism, which is the belief that it's basically libertarians emphasize individual liberty. Modern liberals, in the form of democratic socialist, for example, emphasize the role of government to promote communal liberties, is the best way to put that. So individual liberties, that there should be as little government interference on my individual liberties, as opposed to the idea that government ought to exist to promote human flourishing, broadly construed, right? So we see this kind of liberalism at work, for example, in various interpretations of Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, that all men are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What is the pursuit of happiness? Right? I have a video on Jefferson's idea of happiness, but basically, Jefferson's idea of happiness is the idea that in order to make a flourishing society, in order to provide a flourishing society, people ought to have access to certain basic things. What these things are is hotly debated. Some people might say that people ought to have access to basic health care. This is what's sometimes called universal health care in the United States. People ought to have access to some of these things we've already adopted. Education, for one, universal education. The United States has universal education in the form of K through 12 schools. All people have access to K through 12 education. That was a liberal idea, that people, in order to flourish, need access to that. Right? So that's the fundamental division in liberalism, between libertarianism, emphasis on individual rights on the one hand, and the more social modern liberalism centered on communal / group flourishing on the other hand. And that division's not always super clear. And as with everything in politics, there's a lot of debate about it, right? But if you're interested in that, there's a lot of material I can point you in the direction of. Okay, so we have conservatism, liberalism. Now we'll talk a little bit about socialism. So modern liberalism begins with the Enlightenment specifically. Modern socialism really begins after that last point on the historical scale that I mentioned, which is industrialization. As I said before, industrialization brought about increasing levels of separation between the rich and the poor. And socialism as a political philosophy is really a reaction to that. And socialism will distinguish itself from the type of liberalism that I talked about before, specifically because socialism is a critique of capitalism, of the form of capitalism that liberalism accepts. Two big elements of this critique. The first is the central ownership. This idea that modern day capitalism has to be curtailed, that the solution here is not a free market, a completely free market, but that at some level, government or some governing authority ought to step into that market in order to ensure economic equality. Now, what this economic equality looks like, again, very hotly debated amongst socialists. One of the most popular forms of this is worker ownership of the means of production. So with the advent of industrialization comes the introduction of the factory-based system. I have a lecture on the Industrial Revolution that explains this a little bit more. But simply put, this is the idea that workers ought to have a stake in the companies that they're working for, and that the profit of those companies should not just go to the people at the top, but should be distributed to everybody who is a part of that company. We have some modern examples of this, even in countries like the United States that might or historically been opposed to socialist policies. This comes in the form of unions, for example. Unionization is an inherently socialist practice. Worker co-ops, companies that adopt a cooperative system over and against a hierarchical system. So for example, you might see a restaurant that is owned by the workers. So even the waiter / waitress has a stake in the profits that the restaurant makes. That's kind of what they're talking about here, but applied to a larger political scale. So socialism as a critique of capitalism argues for central ownership. And along with this is the socialist idea that capitalism, free market conservatism, is morally and politically flawed, that the government ought to have a bigger part in managing and maintaining capitalist markets. Again, a lot of disagreement over what that looks like, but that's the gist of it. And finally, we have anarchism. Anarchy, generally speaking, is the view that government has no legitimate authority over people. It's a challenge to the ontological status of government. And it's also the ethical claim that a good, ethical, moral life can only be lived without constraining or limiting structures of government. This idea, again, we're talking in very simplistic terms here, is the idea that government is inherently bad, for lack of a better word, that government is inherently bad for people. And that as a result, government should be done away with. Anarchy is skeptical of the justifications of authority and power of government and makes moral claims about the importance of individual liberty, that we don't need government in order to be good people. This has classic representations. Again, there are precursors to this in classic philosophy. Since I talked about Confucianism earlier, a classic representation of anarchical of anarchy as a political movement can be found in the tradition of Taoism. The idea that political power is unnatural and that the pursuit of this unnatural endeavor only leads to pain and suffering. We have a quote here that kind of summarizes the idea behind anarchism. If there is a state, a political institution, there must be domination of one class by another, and as a result, slavery. The state without slavery is unthinkable, and this is why we are enemies of the state. That states inherently exist on the exploitation of people, on the creation of these social classes, with one class being inherently subservient to the other. And as a result, states are ethically unjustifiable. Now, again, this is just a super broad introduction. If you're interested in this, I'm more than happy to provide you some links, but I hope that you found this helpful. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out and ask. All right, see you all next time.